Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Rantoul at the Chanute Air Museum. From 1917 to 1993, this was the Chanute Air Base. It became the museum in 1994, and if you're an air fanatic, you have got to see this. Well, let's start our tour in back when this was an air base. This was one of 4 hangars. This is the only hangar that's part of the Air Museum, but you can get an idea of the size of this air operation when it was an Air Force base. Mark Hansen, you're the curator of the museum, and in this hangar we've got a wonderful exhibit display of various planes that were used through the years by the Air Force. Tell me first, you've been curator of this museum for how long?
Since 2004.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So you know it pretty well.
I think so, yeah. Longevity will do that for you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're going to, as we go through this program, we're going to get a chance to see these planes, some missile silos, which we'll discuss in a little bit of history of Chanute Air Base, and some of the squadrons that have served here. But starting here, I really wanted to start in this hangar because what you have here is these wonderful examples of planes that served the Air Force through the years. What about this first one we see?
What we're looking at here is a T-6 Texan, World War II vintage trainer. Before pilots would get into anything like a P-51, P-38, they'd have to go through a series of flight training. Mm-hmm. And this was what was called an advanced trainer, retractable landing gear, a hotter airplane to fly that prepared them for when they would actually get into the fighters. Mm-hmm. So this was the training aircraft for the Air Corps for World War II for fighter pilots. I believe some bomber pilots also flew them. It's got the big radial engine, so there was a lot of engine management that had to go on with these airplanes. And for the pilot, this airplane was a pretty good stepping stone into some of the frontline aircraft.
You know, some museums insist that everything in the museum is airworthy, and they actually take it out to fly. But none of these will ever fly again.
No, these are all on loan to us by the United States Air Force. And so we work with the Air Force Museum, which handles their loans, to make sure that we take care of them the best that we can and meet the requirements that they have for us. So no, these will never fly. They're true museum pieces.
Everybody's heard of the Mustang.
Yep.
This one we're looking at is the P-51H.
Yep. This one is a little bit different. When people think of the Mustang, they think of the D model, which was made in large numbers for World War II. Some would argue the P-51D was the best fighter of World War II. North American who built the airplanes, there was a need for a lighter, faster, longer range fighter, especially for the Pacific, because of the long distances over water. And the British saw that need very early on in the war and actually talked to North American about building a long-range fighter. That fighter became the P-51, but the super long-range version didn't come about until later, and that's what the P-51H was meant to represent. It's about 80% different than the P-51D, so it's almost an entirely different airplane. So the guys who restore this airplane have run into a lot of challenges with finding parts, because if they find a P-51D part, chances are it won't work on this airplane.
It's being restored right now.
Yes, right now, yep.
And it's interesting. Let's move along, keep going here. It's interesting because you have a number of planes in your collection here that are in the process of being restored.
Yes.
And you have a group of volunteers. These are experienced air mechanics and maintenance people who do that as their volunteers.
It's their hobby. Our P-51 guys have been working on that airplane for 9 or 10 years. That one's coming to an end. But it's really a labor of love.
Well, it is a labor of love.
And these guys, I would say, especially our P-51 guys, they are experts on their airplane.
Now, we're looking at the T-33 Shooting Star.
Yep.
What was it used for?
Well, the Germans came up with the first operational jet fighter, the Germans and the British, toward the end of World War II. The United States needed to keep pace with the new jet technology. And so toward the end of World War II, the United States also had a jet fighter. Wasn't very good, but they kept on it, and the T-33 or P-80 is the first successful operational United States jet fighter. It's got some notable points of fame. The U.S. leading ace in World War II was actually killed in a P-80. It served in Korea. It was the first, like I said, the first operational jet fighter. Didn't fare very well against the Russian-built MiGs, and so it was primarily then relegated to ground support, dropping bombs, napalm. Didn't turn out to be a very good fighter aircraft based on the other jets that it had to face.
You know, I'm going to digress here just for a moment because we're not going to get back over here. If you look behind us, these immense blue silos, they look like silos, that's exactly what they are. And during this program, we're going to talk about and show what a missile silo looked like, because this is where they trained on maintenance of missile silos. But these would have been stacked. What we're seeing is portions that would have been stacked one on top of the other, and it would have been maybe 100 or more feet deep into the ground. So this is an example of how big, how massive a missile silo was if they were stacked on top of each other. We're going to come back to this as we go. Over here, I recognize this one. This was an F-4.
Yeah, this is actually an RF-4, or a YRF-4, reconnaissance. You can see the windows in the nose. Camera equipment would have been in there. But basically, it's an F-4, specialized F-4 for special
And those
mission.
were in use for a long, long time, weren't they?
Yes, they saw a lot of combat in Vietnam. And used by both the Air Force and the Navy.
And then this is another, I guess, another fighter, huh?
Yes, this is the F-86. This was the answer to the Russian-built MiGs in the Korean War. The one notable difference that we see in this airplane as opposed to the other ones, that it has swept wings. When this plane went on the drawing board, it did not have swept wings. It actually had straight wings. But after World War II, the knowledge that was gained from the German jet program and their 262, which had the swept wings, it was discovered that the swept wings helped a lot, especially at high speed. And so the design was changed to have swept wings. This airplane could go toe-to-toe with the Russian MiGs in Korea. Its Achilles heel was it didn't quite have the altitude that the MiGs did, but if the MiGs came down to their level, the F-86 was definitely an equal match. It was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Some versions they tried 4 20mm cannons in the nose. It's a lot of firepower.
I'd like to see those right now. I wish they were.
Yeah, unfortunately, this airplane, they've been removed, but you can see these patches actually cover the gun ports. Couple problems with the guns. If they were fired for too long, it could actually slow the airplane down. So they had to be careful of going into a stall. And also they had gas ingestion problems. The gases that would come out of the firing of the guns, if too much of that was sucked into the intake, it would actually flame out the engine. So some caution was required.
Something that an aircraft engineer might not think of until you actually got to putting it in the air.
This aircraft was not supersonic in level flight. It could break the sound barrier in a dive, but not under its own power.
Well, next we're going to see, I think, one of the biggest bombers I may have ever seen. We're going to turn a corner and see one of those. That's a very impressive plane, so let's walk that way.
All right, sounds good.
Mark, in the middle section of this hangar, we turn the corner and now we're standing under, I don't know if I can reach up and touch it, this massive bomber. What is this?
This is a B-58. It was the first supersonic nuclear bomber. It was designed as a nuclear deterrent. State-of-the-art aircraft in its time. It's hard to see standing here, but it's got a very unique delta wing construction. A lot of very groundbreaking manufacturing techniques were used, some composite material honeycombed together, and it was designed to drop a nuclear weapon.
And it was jet powered.
Yes.
So this would have been built, what, in the 60s maybe?
Toward the end of the 50s, early 60s. It wasn't very long-lived because of the project went way over budget. It was very difficult to maintain in the field. But this was one of the frontline deterrents.
Would this spin the nuclear weapon down here?
Yeah, those pods are actually pretty interesting. They had several purposes. The nuclear weapon would be in that pod, but there were different configurations that pod could take. There could be fuel in there. There could be nuclear weapons. There were several options they could do with the pod. The interesting thing about the pod was it had to be on the airplane, or the airplane got very tail heavy. So when they were loading the pod, as you see here, ours has a broken front strut, so we've got this support here, but actually this support hooks onto mounting points up in here. So when they were loading or unloading the pod, they could actually hang weights on the nose to keep the nose down, so it wouldn't tip over on its tail.
And then over here, straight back, that the B-52, everybody's heard of the B-52, and that was also a massive bomber, wasn't it?
Yeah, that is actually the nose section that was used here at Chanute to train firefighters on crew extraction in case of an accident. But yeah, the B-52 still in use today. It's going to be in use for quite a long time. Again, originally designed as a nuclear bomber, but it's really shown that it's a multitasker. Can do a lot of different things. It replaced airplanes like the B-58, the B-47. It's going to be in use for quite a while.
And you mentioned no, this is not a B-58. What is this?
This is a B-25.
B-25.
Yeah, we're kind of back to World War II again. This was a medium bomber, one of the more successful medium bombers. Smaller bomb load than a B-17 or a B-24, but again, a multitasker. They came in a lot of different versions with a lot of different armaments. Some were gunships for strafing. Some actually had small artillery pieces in the nose. And of course, they drop bombs. This one is actually a B-25N, which basically means that it started life as a B-25J, and it would have had the tail gunner and top turret gunner that most people think about when they think of World War II bombers. But at the end of World War II, they wanted to extend the life of these airplanes a little bit more. And so as they started to show a little age, they did some retrofits and some upgrades that removed the armament, upgraded some of the electrical systems, and they were used for training. Navigators might train in these, and also they were hacks. So pilots who were here at Chanute that needed to keep up their multi-engine time, they could potentially fly an airplane like this to keep their hours up.
They also trained people here to maintain the ICBM missile silos.
Yes.
And interestingly, you have one of those on display here for people, and you can actually see how it works. We saw the silos, parts of the silos earlier. Let's walk that way and see that part of it. Okay, Mark, we're looking at a Minuteman Missile. And at Chanute, actually, Chanute was the training place for people from all over the country to come to learn how to maintain these silos where the Minuteman Missile was placed.
How to launch them, basically the entire weapon system.
And we are standing on one of the training grounds that you used to use right then. It's very interesting. We pointed out the silos a little bit earlier and said that they could be as much as 100 feet below ground. And you can see how long a missile would be. But we're standing on a concrete pad here right now. And this is where the trainers, the Chanute Air Force folks, would come to, and what they would do is they would pull that hatch back right there, and that was their access to the silo. Am I right?
Right, in the field, yep.
Okay. And so after they would get in there, what would they do?
Well, there's equipment. The silos had to be climate controlled, had to make sure there was no water in there for the missile. And so how that is an access to the silo and the equipment that would do that. At Chanute, because they were training people, they couldn't have all the guys go down the hatch, so there's actually another way to get into this underground silo. We have a stairwell over there. But what we're looking at here is basically what they would see if they were out in the field. There'd be the small personnel hatch, and then of course the actual silo hatch.
And then that's where I'm going now. I'm actually trotting on the silo hatch, aren't I?
Yes, you are over the silo.
So this holds, somehow you have to be able to lift this. Come over here this way, Mark, if you would. Somehow you have to be able to lift this up and get it out so you can get to expose the missile. How does that work?
Well, this hatch weighs something in the neighborhood of 300 tons, so you're not really going to lift it. There were actually motors that would slide this entire hatch back off the silo on huge tracks.
Okay, so that's the tracks we see there. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so this slides
back. That would open up basically the tube for the silo, so they could actually either load the missile with something called a missile erector, which was a giant trailer that would basically load the missile body down in there, so the engine and the body of the missile. The other thing that it had to do was load the warhead and the guidance systems. They would do that with a special semi-trailer truck that would be backed over the closed hatch. Yep. And then it would rest on these metal arms. They would then roll the door back to expose the bottom of the trailer and the top of the missile. They would seal everything off to maintain climate control. Then they would lower the warhead and the guidance system through the bottom of the trailer and mate it to the missile that was already loaded in the silo.
And they wouldn't do that unless they were fairly certain they were going to use it soon. That wasn't a routine maintenance.
For deterrence, I believe that there were missiles that were armed at all times.
Stayed armed.
Yep. So in case of an emergency, there were prescribed times that it would take to launch a missile. Loading a warhead and a guidance system was a fairly involved process. So a lot of that was done ahead, and there were missiles that were ready to go.
The intercontinental ballistic missiles, in this case the Minuteman, they're still around. There are still silos just like this around the country.
Different versions. Yep. Chanute started with the Minuteman 1, and I think when Chanute closed, they were working with the Minuteman 3. Just improved weapon systems.
Right over your shoulder is another. Now that's a gorgeous plane, and that looks like something that would have been flown by the Thunderbirds, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's. It's got a fairly interesting story. It's actually an F-5, which is the militarized cousin of the T-38. When Chanute was here, they couldn't get a T-38 to paint like a Thunderbird, so they actually took an F-5 and changed out some of the parts to make it look like a T-38, so they can have an example of a T-38 Thunderbird. So.
And then right next to it, everybody's heard of the Blue Angels. You have one of the older Blue Angel models there.
Yep, that is an A4. Chanute always had a Navy contingent for most of its life, and the Navy adopted that A4 and painted it as a Blue Angel, kind of as a Navy pride scenario.
Yeah.
So,
and then right next to it, and I'm going to move out of the way here so we can get a shot at it. Right next to it, what about the gray one?
Yeah, that's the missile with the man in it. Very short-lived F-104, short-lived jet fighter, very small wings, very powerful engine. The Air Force didn't use them very much. They developed some better aircraft, but those aircraft served for quite a while in the German Air Force. It's a fast airplane, but it had a reputation of being fairly dangerous because of those small wings. It required some very special skills to fly. That airplane is actually one of the few airplanes that we have in the collection that did not fly into Chanute. Most of these other planes were flown in. That one did not. It was actually used at the factory as a drop tester. And basically what that means is they would subject airplanes to being dropped and shaken up and rattled around to make sure that they could withstand.
It was a crash dummy plane.
Pretty much. And so our understanding is that that one was used for those types of testing. So it wasn't safe to fly, so they brought it here for training purposes.
Well, Mark, beginning in 1929, this style of radial engine started to be built. What made a radial engine different than another engine?
Well, like the engines in your car are called inline engines, where the pistons basically sit in a line over a crankshaft. In a radial engine, you can see the pistons actually go around, the crankshaft. Radial engines don't need complicated cooling systems. As you can see, the fins, they basically cool themselves with ram air coming against the engine, where a radial engine or an inline engine needs some sort of a cooling system because the way it's set up, air can't get everywhere it needs to get to. And so when aviation was evolving, radial engines and inline engines kind of evolved together and improved. This engine here, the 985, was used in civilian aircraft. It was used in some military aircraft. Different solutions to how to power an airplane.
Yeah. You don't see a lot of radial engines anymore. I guess the straight line is sort of, when you're not in a jet engine, the straight line is sort of
a little bit easier to maintain.
This is interesting because you actually have this as a display so that you can see how these pieces interact with one another. What do we look for here?
Well, this is an R4360. And basically what this is showing is all the parts in this engine. It's showing the combustion cycle, showing all the gearing that drives the propeller shaft in the front and some of the accessories in the back. This was built by the training aids branch at Chanute Field to help train engine mechanics on the different parts, how they work, how they fit together.
It happens to be helpful for us, too.
Yes. This was one of the biggest radials that was ever built.
Oh, and this is a radial, similar to...
Yes, this is a radial. The difference between this radial and, for example, the other radial, the pistons still go around the crankshaft, but it's this helical wrapping around. And the reason that was done is to make sure, well, one of the reasons was to make sure that airflow could get to all of the cylinders. They did make twin row radials. But the cylinders in the back didn't get quite as much air, and so this was one mechanism to kind of help with that, and it also helped with design parameters of the airplane, make sure it fit inside the wing or wherever the engine had to go.
What's a rocket motor?
Rocket motor is an engine that produces thrust with a chemical reaction. So unlike a jet engine, which burns fuel and blows exhaust out the back, a rocket engine is basically a chemical reaction that creates an expansion of gas, which then blows out the back of the engine. Similar concept to a jet engine, but the physics is different. This one here is an XR-11 of the type that would have been used in Chuck Yeager, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier.
Yeah.
So you can see it's fairly small.
Yeah. But
enough thrust coming out the nozzles and the mixing chambers for the chemicals to provide that thrust. The reactants in this engine, I believe, were liquid oxygen and alcohol. So when those two things would mix together, there was a chemical reaction that would then provide thrust out the back.
Yeah. And then, of course, jet engines, they really became preeminent through...
After World War II, with the development of the jet engine, that sort of changed everything, especially for military aviation and commercial airline aviation. You get higher speeds. It just, simpler to run. I've read and talked to pilots who said when they went from propeller-driven aircraft to jet engines, they were just amazed that all they basically had to do was push the throttle forward and you went. There wasn't a lot of engine control that you had to do. You didn't have to worry about propeller controls. It just simplified the pilot's job in that respect. Greater speeds, greater range. This one here is a J33, very typical engine. Again, it's a cutaway that was used at Chanute to show all the different parts and how they fit together. You know, the combustion cans, all the gearing. These engines were a type that would have been used in some of the early Air Force jets, P-80, T-33, that sort of thing.
Yeah. The cutaway is very helpful for us, too. Mark, many people know the 99th Pursuit Squadron as the Tuskegee Airmen. When they were here at Rantoul, at Chanute, they were called the 99th Squadron. But these were the folks, all of them except the pilots, they all trained here before they went to Tuskegee, right?
For that squadron, yes.
Yeah. Interesting piece of history.
Yes. The reason for that was Tuskegee Army Airfield was under construction because the Air Corps wanted to be sure that all the African Americans were in one place. They didn't want them scattered because they really didn't think that this was going to work. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us here at Chanute, they felt that the technical people, now they were building a brand new squadron, so they needed mechanics and typists and parachute riggers. They couldn't pull anybody from anywhere else because they didn't exist. They felt that those technical skills, those technical people, the ground crewmen, were going to take much longer than the pilots to train, as much as 3 years. So they wanted to start their training immediately. And Chanute was chosen. Some people say because Chanute was the best technical training base in the Air Corps. Other people say because other bases said absolutely not, we don't want these guys here. And so they came here in March, and so the 99th Pursuit Squadron was actually activated and formed here at Chanute, not at Tuskegee. To the Air Corps' surprise, it took them less than a year to complete their training. So by November, all of the personnel in the 99th who were at Chanute were down at Tuskegee, where they joined their pilots and became the full squadron.
And fortunately, there were a lot of photographs left from those days. Here's a good one here, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. There's, of course, some of them are lounging around a little bit, but there's one up here where they're marching either back to their barracks or to mess or something. And this is interesting because this group up here, this is the hangar that you and I were just in.
Yes.
Isn't it?
It sure is. Yeah, that is the people were trained for different things, and this happens to be the graduating class for the aircraft mechanics. And not surprisingly, that was one of the larger groups that were trained here, and that is outside of our hangar.
Well, that's fascinating. You know, there are way too many exhibits to be able to show you in a 30-minute program. You'll have to come here on your own. But beyond this, the 99th Squadron and the missiles and the planes, and like I say, a half dozen other exhibits make it a great day trip. With another Illinois story in Rantoul, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you. For a DVD copy of the program you've just seen, send $19.95 to Network Knowledge, P.O. Box 6248, Springfield, Illinois 62708. Be sure to include the program name, subject, and when the program aired. You can also order with your credit card by calling 800-232-3605.